Yeah, so I'm selling all my cameras except for the one that's filming me right now. After being a videographer and a filmmaker for many years, you tend to accumulate a lot of stuff. And a lot of times that's a good thing. You know, you're working, you're filming, and problems arise, and then you get things to solve those problems. And a lot of times it works out great. You know, it makes your life easier, can make you more money, and you can learn a lot in the process. Right now, I'm at a point where I found this new camera and it works really great for me and does pretty much everything I need it to where all these other cameras basically don't really serve me much of a purpose anymore. And rather than just having these sit around and collect dust, I'd like to put them in the hands of other people that might actually use them and put them to work. Plus, using the money that I get from selling it to maybe fund some new things that will fit better into my workflow. So now basically I want to go through all these cameras one by one and basically explain maybe why I got it in the first place and why it doesn't necessarily work for me right now. So first off is my number one go-to camera for the past about 2 years, the Canon R7. Now, I actually really love this camera. I've always loved the APS-C sensor size format, and for a long time, these cameras were really neglected by the industry. Before this, I was using a Panasonic GH4 with a speed booster to fit Canon EF lenses. And while that was a great camera with great image quality, didn't have 10-bit, didn't have a good log profile, didn't have continuous autofocus, didn't have image stabilization. It was just missing a lot of things that newer cameras coming out all had. And I felt like my video work was suffering because I didn't have a lot of these incredibly useful features for when it comes to a one-man shooter. So finally, Canon came out with this. It's a APS-C size sensor, an RF mount, shoots 4K 10-bit 422, has image stabilization, incredible autofocus, dual SD card slots, and it pretty much ticked off everything I wanted in a camera. It was also great because for the past 10 years, I've been using EF lenses ever since my Canon T3i days. So I was able to get this RF to EF adapter, and this has a ND filter slide in right here. And that way I didn't have to bother with screwing filters onto the front of my lens. And you know, when I got this, it really felt like a mini C70. It could shoot in C-Log, had a fantastic image, basically had internal NDs with this lens adapter, and my favorite lens could live on it, the Sigma 18-35 f1.8. Now, I got a lot of good use out of this camera, but there are two major drawbacks to it, which is why I'm selling it. First off was one of the main reasons I got this camera, which was the image stabilization. I gotta be honest, the image stabilization on this camera just isn't that good. It's almost like they tried to make it too good and then it just became terrible. For me, I like to use my in-body stabilization just to take out the shakes in my footage. I like shooting handheld and I like the look of handheld, but with these small cameras, it can just get really jittery really fast without a lot of rigging. And with this camera, the image stabilization is really aggressive, which gives it this sort of floaty, unnatural look, and also causes a lot of warping in the image that just looks really bad, frankly. It's also impossible to use image stabilization with a wide lens on this camera. I've tried and it just doesn't work. And I know that's been the case for a long time, but on this new camera, I can use super wide lenses with image stabilization and it's never really a problem. And the second reason why I'm selling this camera is kind of two reasons packed together. It's the size. Frankly, APS-C mirrorless camera doesn't really need to have a body this big. This body is still about the same size as like a full-size DSLR, which just seems kind of unnecessary. And along with the kind of chunky body, it has the RF mount. Now, at first I was excited for this because I could use this ND adapter and mount all the EF lenses that I already had. But over the years, I've been watching all these really great budget lenses come out that are super fast, super compact, and they were made by third-party manufacturers. But for some reason, Canon just does not let third-party manufacturers make RF lenses. And especially when it comes to their crop sensor bodies, that really only leaves you with their line of RF full frame lenses, which are expensive and don't really have the speed or the focal ranges I'm looking for, plus they're pretty massive, or leaving me with EF lenses, which are old, they're noisy, and they're just quite big. I mean, look at the size of this setup. I mean, this is like pretty much the size of my head. So when I was traveling around, I either had to carry a backpack with me to keep this in, or just not bring it with me at all, which is what I ended up doing a lot. And I didn't like that. I wanted to have a super powerful camera with me that just wasn't this big. I mean, it's almost the size of my fully built out cinema rig. So yeah, really great camera. I mean, it treated me super well. I do recommend it to people, especially if you're on a budget. The image quality is fantastic. The colors are incredible. But between the wonky image stabilization and just the severe lack of compact budget lens options, I'm selling it. Now, speaking of my cinema camera, I'm also going to be selling this one too. This is the ZCAM E2 M4. It's a micro four thirds cinema camera, and it's treated me super well. I remember when I first got this camera really upped my filmmaking game. I could rig it out to fit my needs. It had a much higher dynamic range than I was used to, much higher bit depth than I was used to. I could shoot in log and color grade. And frankly, just bringing a rigged out cinema camera to a set just increased my value as a video producer. There's not really that much bad I could say about this camera. It's a pretty budget-friendly cinema camera, very similar to the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema 4K. I was using it with a speed booster that connects to an EF mount, so I got brighter image, a wider image, and I could fit all my EF lenses on it that I already had. And the reason I'm selling it is, honestly, I just don't like using it that much. It taught me a lot about filmmaking and about cinematography, and I'm really glad I went with this option at the time that I bought it. But honestly, it's just pretty cumbersome to use. It doesn't have continuous autofocus like a lot of cinema cameras. It doesn't have image stabilization like a lot of cinema cameras, which is fine, you know. Cinema cameras aren't really meant to have a lot of those one-man band features, but they come in handy. It's also just kind of bulky. You know, this isn't something I can toss in a backpack and ride around on my bike and go around the city and shoot with, you know. This is something I only really bring to a production set with a client. And also because it has to be rigged out, there's just like a lot of things on it. I kind of cheaped out on the monitor, and the monitor has a slight delay, so not ideal. I shoot to an SSD, which is really great. It's super useful. I could just plug it right into my computer and start editing, but having your storage just mounted on the side of the camera with like a cable connecting it just can be problematic sometimes. Navigating the menus and the button system just isn't great. The buttons are really mushy and they're all custom, which is great, but I forget what they're mapped to half the time, and it's just not as simple and reliable as just having buttons and dials right where your hand rests. So in this case, I do like the more mirrorless hybrid options where it has those button and dials, and it's super easy to use, and it has those autofocus stabilization features, and it can still be rigged up for shoots if I need to, but it could also be super compact for when I need it to. Once again, great camera, glad I got it, but it's just been collecting dust. You know, I just don't use it as much as this camera. Next up is my Sony ZV-1. Now, I absolutely adore this camera. I think I've made a couple videos about it and how much I love it. I mean, this thing is so tiny. It has a great lens on it, a flip out screen, hot shoe, mic input. The image quality that comes out of it is pretty good. I mean, it's a solid little tiny camera. I do have a sweet spot for this camera because once I got this camera is when I started bringing cameras with me everywhere. It could fit in my pocket, it had great image quality, and I just started documenting my entire life. And it's just super fun to use. You could hand it to friends, they had fun using it. I love the look of it, I love the build of it. It's just a really well-made little camera. And for a long time, people have been claiming that these little point and shoot cameras were dying because of, you know, cell phone cameras. And I had a strong belief that that was not the case. I was getting footage out of this camera that no cell phone could ever get. But that was until the iPhone 15 Pro came out. And once I got my hands on this camera and started testing it, it was pretty comparable to this camera. And in cases where it wasn't, I would just find myself reaching for this camera, which isn't that much bigger than this one. Okay, I'll admit, it's not this tiny, but nothing I can't, have on a strap that just sits by my side with a tiny lens. And since I've gotten the iPhone and this new camera, I haven't used this camera once. But honestly, pulling it out now and holding it and using it a little bit makes me kind of not want to sell it, because I really do love this camera. It's a great little camera. But yeah, I just don't use it. Maybe I'll keep it, or maybe I'll sell it. I should probably sell it, but maybe I'll keep it. But yeah, Sony ZV-1, fantastic little camera, but between my iPhone 15 Pro and this new compact mirrorless camera, it might be time to retire it. But highly recommend if you're looking for a cinematic, high quality point and shoot. Now, another reason I'm just selling these three cameras in general is, as you can probably tell, they're all different systems. This is a ZCAM, this is a Canon, and this is a Sony, which hasn't really caused me any problems, but when you're shooting with multiple cameras, you have to try to color match them in post. They all use different cables and different batteries and stuff like that, and you just start to develop all this stuff, and it can get disorganized and messy and not hard to keep track of, but it would make life a lot easier if I just had all one lens system, all one battery system, all one cable system, which is what I'm trying to do now with my new camera system. All right, moving forward, we have something a little different. This is a Canon film camera. It's the Canon EOS Elan. Now, this was a really exciting get for me because I had started to experiment with film photography a lot, and I'm really glad I did, because it's a super cool thing to learn and figure out, and the aesthetic of film is just super cool. Now, the reason I went with this camera is because it actually has an EF mount, which means I could use all the lenses I use for my digital cameras on this film camera, which was a game changer. It even has some autofocus capabilities and a built-in exposure meter, so it made learning film really easy and quite fun, actually. Now, what I'm about to say might be kind of controversial. Even though I really love the aesthetic of film, I don't really like using it that much. And I know I'm probably gonna get a lot of hate for this, because a lot of real photographers claim that film is the only way to go because it makes you stop and think and consider your shots and really focus on the amount of frames you have left in the roll and make them count, and really take your time, dial in your settings, and focus on the image that you're gonna have. And that's super cool. I really respect that mentality, but honestly, digital just works better for me. I like having basically unlimited photos to take. I love spraying and praying and just seeing what images come out. I love being able to just plug in an SD card into my computer or transfer the images over Wi-Fi and share them with my friends. And just because I'm shooting digital doesn't mean I can't stop and take my time and really focus on an image just like you do with film. And yeah, the aesthetic of a digital photo is not the same as a film photo, but my new camera comes pretty dang close. You know, it has film simulations that mimic the look of film, but immediately into a JPEG that you can share. Yeah, it's not the same as film, but it comes pretty close and just matches my workflow that I like to use, so I think I'm just gonna stick with that. Plus, film is just expensive. I mean, these days it basically comes out to like $1 a photo, so I don't know, with all the pictures I want to take, it can kind of add up and be cumbersome, you know, going to a shop, waiting to get the film developed. I will say though, not much beats the feeling of waiting for your images to develop and finally getting them and getting to look at them. That is a fun experience that you don't really get with digital cameras. And also, because I'm selling my EF mount cameras, keeping all my lenses just to fit on this film camera that I don't use doesn't really make any sense. So I will say I do still have a roll of film in this that I need to finish, so probably gonna finish that and then sell it. Or maybe I'll keep this too. I mean, no, I shouldn't. Anyway, cool film camera if you have EF lenses. Lastly is this GoPro Hero 7. I think a GoPro is always something good to have in your toolkit, and when this first came out, the hypersmooth stabilization was a game changer. But honestly, this thing has been so unreliable for me. I don't know if it's operator error or what, but the battery just does not last. The footage never really turns out the way I want it to, and half the time I can't get it to turn on, or the recording freezes midway through, or in cold weather just doesn't work at all. And I swear every time I try to use this camera for something, it just doesn't work out right. And frankly, when it comes to action sports stuff, now that I have the iPhone 15 Pro and its hypersmooth image stabilization, I can get a lot of cool looking shots, and I already know I'm gonna have my phone on me versus having to go and snag this camera and make sure it's charged and make sure it's working and all that stuff. I will say the only reason I have it still and will hang on to it for a little longer is that it's my only completely waterproof camera. So it did come in handy when I went to the Great Barrier Reef, and this was the only camera I could really use to film underwater. But I think in the future, I'm gonna opt for a Insta360 camera, because not only are those waterproof underwater action cameras, but because they're 360-degree cameras, that's a new form of shooting that none of these other cameras can do, which gives me more options versus just using this, I guess. Anyways, that's all my cameras, and yeah, I think I'm getting rid of them all. My new camera has been working out great for me, and it can do almost everything these can do, but in a very compact, small body that I can take with me anywhere pretty much. Now, a lot of this is just to say, you don't need all this stuff. I've spent 10 years sort of accumulating all this stuff, and I was always a firm believer that you should be choosing the tool for the job. And yeah, I would use each of these cameras for different reasons, for different gigs, for different shots, for different projects, whatever fit the bill for what I was doing. But if you could find a workhorse that fits pretty much everything that you do, why not just invest your time and money and gear into one system that works for you? And I understand it could be hard to not be precious about these kinds of things. I have a sentimental attachment to all these cameras and what they did for my life and career and creativity, but when they're just sitting on a shelf collecting dust, it doesn't really help anyone. So I hope this video helps. I hope you can maybe purge some of your belongings and invest in something that works best for you. If you'd like to know the one camera that I'm replacing all these with, that will probably be in my next video. So stay tuned, subscribe if you're interested. But time to say good riddance to all these cameras and really just minimalize my workflow, minimalize my belongings, and just make my workflow easier and a lot more efficient, and hopefully make better, cooler things, you know, without all this stuff I don't need. Anyway, stay tuned for videos about this new camera, and if you have any questions about any of this stuff, leave a comment below and I'd be happy to answer.